You click the button. We are live.
We are live. Well, hello, and welcome to our Confessions of a Recovering Engineer live session. I'm Chad, and I'm joined again by my podcast co host, Stephen. Hey, Stephen.
It's good. I'm good, thank you. How are you? It's not a Friday, is it? We're doing this on a Thursday for a we
Uh,
haven't done that many of these, but the intention is we're going to do them on Thursday and Fridays, but it's Easter, and so we're doing it a day early.
we have an expression here. We say it's jeudi, which is a contraction of jeudi, Thursday, and vendredi, Friday. So,
Oh.
because everyone is off tomorrow, we call it the jeudi.
It doesn't
The
feel like
jeudi.
Friday to me because I've got loads of work left to do, and yeah,
Well, that's
you know,
not good.
doing live streams really probably, but that is work for us, isn't it? So
It is, yes. So before we get into the main topics, I'll start by offering an apology to you. The
okay.
last stream, we had a discussion that went off a little from our main topic. We talked about helicopter crashes and famous people who have unfortunately passed away in a helicopter crash. And you suggested, or you said correctly, that it was Kobe Bryant who had passed away in a tragic helicopter incident. And I dismissed it because I had a different recollection as to the vehicle that he had perished in. And I said, no, 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 it wasn't him. But you said, yes, it was. And you were right. So I'm going to start off by offering a sincere apology, contesting your recollection of his passing. I'm
Thank
sorry.
you, and I fully accept your apology. I wasn't very confident when I was saying it because I'm not an expert on basketball, and so I was unsure of the name of the particular basketball player. Um, but this is all evidence of why I don't fly on helicopters. So it
Yes.
hasn't improved my confidence in helicopters any.
And if I would have let you hang there, not say it was Kobe Bryant, I would have
I
let you.
was
You
slightly
wouldn't even
horrified
remember.
at the
So
time.
yeah,
I was slightly horrified at the time that I might have said the wrong person. That was all.
yeah.
So I'm relieved. It's been festering for 2 weeks, Chad. But thank you very much for clarifying that point.
And before we get into the main topic too, can you just explain to everyone why you want to be adored?
It's a
You're putting
lyric
it
from
out there
the
for
Stone it's
everybody.
a lyric from the Stone Roses, who was a 1990s indie band, which is before your time, Chad, as well. And so that's a lyric T-shirt, but also because I'm doing live streams and podcasts, it's obviously in relation to my ego, so it's also probably true as well.
I'm very touched that you think 1990 is before my time, but you have to practice your lying a bit more, especially if you want to continue your career in politics. Because I don't believe it. I don't think anyone watching believes it. But anyhow, let's not get too many tangents because that's where we got into trouble last time. So let's talk about the podcast that came out this week. You hosted it and you talked to a lovely gentleman, Dr. Gabriele Pozzetti. Who is Dr. Pozzetti? Why did you talk to him? Tell me about this episode.
So lots of our podcasts come from people who are Siemens customers and SimCenter users, but this is a guy, who we went to talk to because we'd noticed his expertise in AI and the fact that he was implementing AI strategy for like a materials company. They make kind of very hard-wearing, robust resilient materials, and he'd basically in charge of their AI strategy. We thought he'd be a really interesting person to talk to because he had this kind of big overarching view on AI in engineering. But when we did the pre-interview with him, it turned out that he was actually a former CFD engineer, and that he'd spent the early part of his career, as a CFD developer and a CFD user. And for me, that made this a really interesting episode because lots of what people are thinking about at the moment is their own careers. And if you're kind of a simulation engineer or any kind of engineer, what does the future hold for me? And I guess this is somebody who's had his foot and he's experienced both worlds as well. So he was really enthusiastic because having given up numerical engineering CFD, to have somebody who would talk about nerdy topics like that, I think was quite good for him. So I think he was a fantastic guest and offered a really interesting perspective on both worlds.
Yeah, because he transitioned, like you said, from being a CFD engineer to more focused on AI. So he had a couple of interesting points, some of his confessions, if you would, during your interview. So I think the first one he's pretty much came out with, which he said applies to not just AI, but in general. You need to keep it simple when you're deploying these things. You don't want to overcomplicate it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's part of the problem. So he had this come up with this fantastic analogy of kind of traditional engineering versus the new AI world. And he does that by introducing two fictional characters. The first one is the professor. So traditional engineers like me, if I'm asked to solve an engineering problem, the first thing I'll do is I'll sit down, write all the physics, write down the equations, and work out if I can solve the equations. And if I can't solve the equations, then I have to simplify them. That's kind of the way that traditional engineering has worked, is by, understanding all the physics and solving equations using number crunching. He also introduces, so that character is called the professor. He also, and basically the professor, when asked to solve a problem, will go and get a textbook off the shelf and start looking at the physics. That's to represent the world of traditional engineering. And to represent the kind of AI future, he talks about the expert. So that's somebody who learns through experience. So if you're an expert in cars, you don't necessarily have to know how a car works or all the physics of an internal combustion engine or a battery or hydrogen or whatever. You learn through experiencing what it's like to drive cars and experiencing cars. And he described AI as being more like that. And so those two worlds both allow us to make predictions. We do it through physics, obviously, but also, AI will do it by experiencing lots of things and using that to predict what might happen in the future as well. And I found that was a really, really good analogy. And he also describes limitations of both those as well, because like I said, quite often you can't write down the equations, or if you can write down the equations, you can't solve them. And of course, AI is limited by the experiences that you can expose it to. And so sometimes predicting things into the future is a bit more difficult. And I think we're going to come on to that in a bit when we talk about the recent engineering news as kind of an element of that occurred this week as well. So for me, that was a really fantastic and interesting view of the difference between AI and engineering, and perhaps some of the different skills that engineers might have to adopt and adapt to in order to live in the new world.
Yeah, what I liked a lot about it was that it presented this more as not AI is going to replace or take over, like, which is kind of the narrative you hear often. Like AI is going to supersede or kind of erase these things. It's kind of more like he presented it as these are complementary. They offer both pros and cons, and if you bring them together, you actually can improve your solution if you take into account the benefits and drawbacks of each approach. So it was a very nice analogy he came up with these two characters to personify each of these approaches. And like you said, they're just predictions. So predictions have strengths and weaknesses to them.
All tools are wrong, all models are wrong, some are useful, which is why you have to be pragmatic and be an engineer. So the other part of the interview was that the reason why we wanted to speak to him, because he'd been involved in implementing an AI strategy across a big company, and so he has some guidance for people or companies who are taking the first steps towards kind of adopting an AI future and digitalization future, and some of the pitfalls of doing that, and some of the pitfalls of handing over your intellectual property to consultants as well. So that was kind of the second part of the interview, and also really, really interesting because I hadn't considered that, because I guess lots of people at the moment are scrambling to be involved in this new world. But there's different ways you can do that. I mean, you can start by learning from scratch, or you can pay other people to do it for you. And he talks about the benefits and the costs of both approaches as well. So for anybody who's thinking about getting involved in AI or is concerned they might not be on the right path, I think it's worth listening to for that part alone. But in general, it was a fantastic conversation with an extremely charismatic guest.
Yeah. And that exchange you had on paying someone, he made a very important point about you still have to understand what's going on. You can't just outsource that, because you'll either be getting a solution you don't completely understand and you're just wasting your money, or you're outsourcing your job eventually to that third party, because they're going to be able to show they know how to do your business better than you. So he had lots of interesting insights. He had very nice ways of presenting it with his metaphors and his unusual expressions, as he even said so himself at the beginning of the interview. He's got a very quirky way of bringing up some of these topics. So, but you got into
a lovely Italian accent as well. So he's a pleasure to talk to and listen to.
Yeah, and you had a nice exchange too about how feasible it is to predict the weather a year from now.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. So there's lots of hype surrounding AI, and one of the things that concerned me, I mean, in the last 6 months, is I saw a company claiming that they can predict the weather in a year's time. Yeah. Now, as a simulation engineer and a kind of professor who understands the physics, yeah, we know about things like chaos, which means that small small errors in any measurement. So if you're measuring the current weather using satellites and meteorology stations and weather balloons, yeah, you can only measure those things to a finite degree of accuracy. So what happens when you use those numbers to seed your basically kind of global scale CFD simulations, any small errors end up being amplified over, maybe a week or 10 days. And so beyond 10 days, weather forecasting isn't very useful because of chaos, because you can't perfectly measure things, and those errors are kind of amplified through the simulation process and in the weather as well. So when you look at your weather forecast and say it says that next Monday, if you want to have a party or a barbecue, there's a 40% chance of rain. That's because they've done lots of different simulations, using slightly tweaked initial conditions. And then 40% of those times, those simulations are predicting it's going to rain, which is why they're kind of stochastic outputs. And so it prompted me to look into the history of kind of weather forecasting as well, which something we've been doing since, I think, 1922. So the first CFD simulation was a weather forecast about 30 years before computers were invented. Somebody did it in the First World War. A guy called Lewis Fry Richardson, while he was an ambulance driver in the First World War, did hand calculations to try and predict the weather using the method that's still basically be done today, but done with supercomputers as well. So that kind of is trying to dispel some of that hype. So when people are saying like we can predict things a year into the future, well, you can't do that for physics reasons. Yeah. And so I've written a blog about this, also written a blog. It also includes about how AI is absolutely going to revolutionize weather forecasting, but those kind of long-term predictions are a long way off as well. So yeah, it inspired me to write a blog on meteorology as well, which we should probably put it in the chat. Chad, I will when you're talking in a second, and the podcast.
Yeah, please, while I ask my next question, you can drop those links in. But do you think AI will at least improve the long-term accuracy for forecasting? Maybe
Yeah,
not a year. Maybe a year
yeah,
is like an extreme, but
yeah.
if
Because
you're not contesting there's a benefit there. You're just
there's
maybe
a massive
a
benefit.
year. Yeah.
So at the moment, in order to provide those forecasts, you have to do basically lots of very, very big CFD simulations, using supercomputers. And those take time and resources. What's happening, and I've got an interview coming up with a company called Physics X, which I've edited now, will be available, in the next month or so, and where they talk about using a smaller number of CFD simulations to make surrogate model predictions. And so, you train a deep learning algorithm on the cell by cell results of the CFD simulation and use that to produce really fast simulations. And what's going to happen with meteorology, and there's something called GraphCast being developed by Google. It means you can do lots of weather forecast simulations at CFD quality, but do them much quicker. You still have to have some basic forecasts in the background, but you can do lots more. And so when we're talking about that 40% thing, you can do, if you do 1,000 forecast, your estimate really quickly, your estimate of that 40% is going to go down to maybe 20% or 10%. So they're going to be more accurate as well. And I think and they're claiming they can go slightly further into the future. So we can go about 10 days into the future now, and we might be able to push that back a bit, but it's never going to be 6 months or a year. So it is absolutely going to revolutionize weather forecasting, but not in that kind of hype-tastic way.
We'll put those links in the chat.
I will.
Yeah. And, we encourage everyone to obviously read the blog and listen to the podcast episode to hear the full interview with Gabriele Pizzetti. And if you like it, follow, subscribe, leave a rating, help us grow our audience. We're looking
even if you don't like it, just hit the follow button, because it just helps.
Or put your predictions for what the weather's going to be like in a year from now, what the weather will be like on March 28th.
But the other thing is, don't you? You know that I can predict that in August 2025, the weather's going to be better than it is in February 2024. That's not.
Well, with global warming, are we sure? Let's not.
Well, maybe not. In general, though, given on any given day, I would bet on some of those things.
I think that's the other problem with some of the forecasting. All the patterns that they kind of use to make predictions are kind of getting askewed with the rapid changing climate. But that's not what we want to talk about next, because if we start with that, we'll never get to the next topic. So the next thing we wanted to talk about, we always like to try and bring up something that's current or recent in the news, and it's hard to avoid this topic because I think everyone has been following it. It's the tragedy of the Key Bridge in Baltimore, that collapsing bridge, and we want to be respectful and acknowledge that there was a loss of life, and it's a terrible tragedy. But there are obviously some engineering applications to what happened. So why don't you kick it off, Stephen?
So it happened. Well, I'm not sure what day it happened. It happened a day this week, and it's one of those things because it happened in the middle of the night, didn't it?
Yeah.
Baltimore time, I think 1:30 a.m. And so when I woke up in the morning and did the usual thing of grabbing my phone and started looking at social media, I saw just it wasn't from a reputable news source, just this animation of the bridge collapsing. And like it was just almost I treated it with disbelief because you see so much kind of CGI or old
Mhm.
stuff on social media that you don't necessarily think it's realistic as well. And it's difficult. It's one of those huge things. It's difficult to comprehend that a boat strike or a ship strike could take down a bridge as well. And so I've seen this video straight away and thought, oh, that's probably not real. And immediately jumped on to the New York Times actually and looked and saw some of the live broadcasting coming out. So I almost experienced that in real time, and to the extent that it was live streamed the bridge. You were worried that there were people and vehicles on the bridge immediately, and you can look at the live stream of the bridge in the moments before the impact happened, and you can count the number of cars and vehicles going across the bridge. And so it was horrifying. And then suddenly realized that actually it looked like there were no moving vehicles on the bridge, but all the yellow flashing lights you could see were probably construction workers. And I think that's been subsequently borne out, and that people had fallen into the water and were at high risk of death. And I think lots of them have actually died as well. So it's horrible to see those tragedies unfold in real time as well, when you know that people's lives are involved as well, and difficult to understand sometimes how these things can happen. So you sometimes see on the horrible social media comments lots of skepticism from people about how something of this magnitude could happen, and why can't these things be engineered out.
Yeah, I think the fact that it was captured so well, which is rare when such a tragedy happens, that's one thing that made people skeptical right away, obviously, because usually when we hear about these things, no one's there with the camera. But this case, there was a camera pointing at the bridge to capture the terrible moment. So that definitely changes our perception of seeing it happen so clearly. And we should say that this is being recorded Thursday morning, and the
Yeah.
facts about the event are still changing. So if you're watching a replay, maybe something's going to come out afterwards that might change some of what we're saying. So this is still a pending open investigation. But from what I understand, at least what they said right now, that this all happened in the span of less than 5 minutes from
Yeah.
when the boat had an issue to the impact. Less than 5 minutes is the time that was. And it sounds as if the crew on board did everything they could to avoid this from happening. So that's tremendous already. That they weren't taking. They called in a mayday right away. Apparently, they tried to drop an anchor to slow the momentum of the boat. But I guess once they experienced an issue, this was just a matter of time before this impact occurred. So I guess as far as the facts seem to support so far, there wasn't necessarily a major issue with the boat in terms of lack of maintenance or lack of crew or anything like that. So, sometimes these failures occur because of that. And the bridge wasn't that old, and it wasn't a bridge that was
It wasn't that new
structurally
either.
so.
It was
Well,
19, it was built in 90. It was opened in
it's 47 years
1977.
old. Yeah.
Yeah, which
But it was well maintained, and there was no known issues with the bridge. So I
and
think
lots of bridges we cross are older than that, and
exactly.
you don't ever expect, do you, those kind
Yeah.
of big bits of infrastructure, buildings and bridges, to be demolished by a vehicle impact, although it happens increasingly, unfortunately, as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things that struck me is that, so when that bridge was designed, firstly, I think it's not possible. You can't design anything to account for all possibilities, not without spending almost infinite amounts of money. So when that bridge was built in 1977, I think the biggest ship in the world, or container ship in the world, was I think 30,000 TEUs, and the bridge and the boat that hit it was 3 times that size. So when you were designing that bridge, and it was built in 1977, but it would have been designed for at least a decade before, those guys couldn't have had any concept of the size of boats and ships operating in that channel, which shows you one of the challenges of engineering, doesn't it? Is you can only future proof these kind of large infrastructure things which have lifespans of decades, to a certain extent, because we can't predict all of the future. And I think our kind of consumer-based economy, I think 70% of all the things we buy come on ships, and so we're largely we're largely unaware of these huge container ships which are going around the world delivering all the stuff we need to keep our comfortable lives happy and all our Amazon deliveries in and those kind of things. They had no concept of those things, and so it makes it really difficult to engineer structures without knowing kind of the things that they might have to experience in the future.
Right. And there's only so much redundancy you can put in. I mean, you could put fenders, pylons, sometimes they have islands to prevent this from happening. But again, like you have to consider the relative risk of an incident occurring versus the cost and the over design. And even then, with the fenders or pylon guards initially put in, be able to a boat that's now 3 times larger than what would have been acceptable at the time even have worked. And it's just tragic that it happened. I guess it was really, it just hit it the right way, to for lack of a better word, but it was colossal in terms of the force and where it impacted this structure. It just came down that because of that. And I don't think there's only so much, like you said, reverse engineering and factors of safety that you can consider before you go, well, this is so improbable, but the cost to prevent this would be so astronomical. We always make these types of considerations when designing structures or products or what have you.
So I think lots of disbelief from members of the public is that they don't really understand kinetic energy, like half mv squared. And so although that ship wasn't visibly moving very quickly, its mass was enormous. And the velocity squared element made that even bigger. Have similar sort of skepticism about the 9/11 attacks as well. The planes are not as big as a boat, but they were traveling very fast, and it just can't disperse that much kinetic energy is actually impossible. But in terms of redundancy, there's only so much redundancy you can build into the civil engineering of a bridge. Of course, what seems to have failed here is the engine and navigation system of the ship. And we were talking about helicopter crashes last week. You're comfortable when you're on a jet airliner that there's redundancy built in, that if one of the engine fails, they'll be able to use a second one and get you to safety. And if both fails, then you kind of hope that they'll be able to glide it in as well. And so we don't tend to worry so much about big container ships, do we? Because you'd assume naively that if the engines failed, then the boat would just sit in some open water. And so didn't really ever think, I didn't think about it. I'm sure it's a concern for the industry about what happens if an engine or some sort of navigation system fails while navigating a boat in close proximity to a bridge and people, and that's a tragic circumstance. All these things normally happen not because of the failure of a single system, but of multiple systems as well. So it really is a horrible, tragic event, and one that we can hopefully learn from, and in the future design better ships and hopefully better bridges. I mean, that's the way that we tend to progress as humanity. We have to have these horrible incidences to learn from them, because we can't always predict them.
Well, I live in Montreal and I'm adjacent to the St. Lawrence River. It's a major shipping corridor. It part of that corridor is New York, Ontario, Quebec, Pennsylvania. There's 50 bridges apparently over that corridor, and they've already released statements saying that they're looking at what happened and taking into consideration that is there more that they could do. So I guess it's there may be some lessons learned, and maybe more protections can be put in for other bridges as a result of this, because I guess because it's so catastrophic what happened, there's still a benefit in maybe exploring how this could be mitigated further, especially since now ships are much larger and the chances of this happening are, I guess, greater than maybe they were when these bridges were initially built. So people are paying attention to it and learning, but I guess ultimately it could turn out that there was a failure on the boat, and it could not be a failure that was so unpredictable to occur as well, not due to lack of maintenance, not due to anything. We don't know yet, but failures occur even when you do everything by the book. So there could have been an unforeseen failure on the boat despite everything being done to code. The bridge as well, and it could just be a very bad series of events that led to this huge tragedy. And in this case, it would just be a tragedy. There's only so much oversight before you can say, well, this was just so unfortunate in terms of the series of events that occurred, and the probability of them occurring was so minute, but it still happened in this case.
And in terms of influence in the future, it seems quite cynical and sad to say, but the human life loss will only go so far into preventing it. It's going to be the economic damage caused in the
Yeah.
Baltimore region. And also, looking in the New York Times again this morning, talking about the problem it's going to cause in logistics. We had that problem during COVID where a ship got stuck in, was it the Panama Canal, I think, as well? And basically the whole of the world, which is so finely tuned to just in time, ground to a halt, and suddenly you couldn't get your electric cars or your washing machine. I tried to buy a washing machine during COVID and you couldn't because that boat was stuck in the Panama Canal. And so actually the downstream consequences will be that do force change will unfortunately only be the economic ones, and probably and hopefully those lives, will have some influence on that decision as well, because it is really, really tragic and horrible.
Yeah, it was horrible.
Horrific is the word, not horrible.
Yeah, terrible. Well, we're almost at the end of our live stream, and we typically end this with a preview of what's to come next. So, Stephen, I'll ask you a question. Who do you think knows you better, Alexa or your wife?
You said that yesterday. It's like we differ in our house. We're in a, you told me that you're not an Alexa family and you're a Siri family.
Siri, yeah.
But in our house, we use Alexa a lot. We use it as an intercom. We're talking over. If we're sitting at dinner and we have a discussion and we can't answer it, we'll ask Alexa to answer it for us. Also got Alexa to change her voice. We made her have a male voice for a little while, but that didn't last. And we changed it to we've got a British voice originally, and we changed to American. It kind of freaked us out a bit as well. So we're very reliant on Alexa, and I do speak to her quite a lot. And I don't know how much information she's tracking about me, but also I'm quite reckless about those kind of things, so I don't really care too much.
You talk a lot in front of her too. She knows all of your secrets.
Yeah, because
she knows why you want to be adored. But the reason why we're talking about Alexa,
I haven't got Alexa in this room, but I would ask her now, Alexa, why do I want to be adored? And she'd probably tell me.
She'll tell you the results she found on the web. Why are we talking about Alexa? You connect the dots.
So our next podcast interview is with somebody called Joanna Pena Bickley, who her official job title now, she's a co-founder and CEO of Vibes AI, but she's also worked with some other huge companies like Uber and IBM and Amazon as well. And so she was one of the early moms of Alexa. She was involved in that project and she's gone on to do lots of other fabulous things in kind of tech and in AI as well. And so we were just getting her perspective on the way the world is heading. She talks a bit about how Alexa was, we're all obsessed by ChatGPT, and talks about the technology behind Alexa and how that was the previous generation, and none of what we're experiencing at the moment should be a surprise. And she was just a fabulous guest who talks about the Matrix and Star Trek, who's like she's a visionary in the world of AI and technology, and also making some of these products commercially successful. So we were very, very lucky. The caliber of guests we're attracting at the moment in the podcast is absolutely staggering as well. So I was very privileged to interview her and had a great 45 minutes talking with her about the current state of AI. She expresses views on some of the kind of negative consequences of AI and people. She's very, very much a kind of pro AI person. And says basically whether you don't believe in AI or not, it's going to go ahead and you need to adapt to it now. So it was a great interview. I really enjoyed talking to her, and it's not out yet. It'll be out. When will it be out, Chad? Next week, probably.
It will be out next week, or
next
week after,
as well. So
it'll be out before our next live stream. That's for sure.
But if you listen to the current podcast with we just talked about, then you also subscribe to the podcast, follow it, and then you'll know all the fantastic guests. Because we also have Physics X coming up as well, which is a fantastic interview about accelerating simulation using AI, and an amazing interview with NASA as well. And so we've got loads of really good guests coming up. So please subscribe to the podcast.
Yes, and leave a review. Drop us a line. Let Stephen and I know what you like. You started, we're here online, live. Feel free to reach out to us. But in 2 weeks' time, we'll talk more about your conversation with Joanna, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more about what Alexa knows about you. But until then, we will be signing off, and thank you for watching us. It's been great talking to you, Stephen.
Have a lovely Easter. Have you eaten any chocolate eggs yet, Chad? Are you going to eat any chocolate eggs?
That's my confession. I've had one. I had one cream egg. I've been good.
One cream egg?
one treatment, like the little ones, like they're like this big. They're not like, you know. How many have you had, Stephen?
Between us, we've had 4.
Yeah, you're gonna try to use the law of averages.
It's one of those things. Is that I grew up in a family where you would, you know, a religious family where we'd have Lent and you wouldn't eat any sweets and you would have to eat your eggs on Easter Sunday. And like the fact that as an adult you can go to the shop and buy an Easter egg and eat it is fantastic to me. So everybody have a wonderful Easter. Don't get too sick of chocolate, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
See you in April. Bye.
Bye.